Awesome. So I'll just jump into it with the first question. So in your work, Caitlin, on anti-racism in education, which story, either from a student, teacher, or your own experience, has stayed with you and has shaped how you approach teaching and learning?
Uh, when I first saw this question, the first thing that came to mind, there's so many stories of students that I've worked with that have stayed with me, and those students and their families have stayed with me. In fact, I'm meeting with some of my old students January 2nd. They've been graduated for many years because those relationships are never ending and they go on, just like the stories of the kids, like just seeing what amazing things they do. But there's one story that and every time I've been interviewed, it keeps coming back to me. And it was when I was in my last high school. And when I had come into my last high school, I had had 5 years at my previous high school supporting Indigenous students, and it was such a fulfilling role.
Mhm.
And we were able to help all of the students to graduate and transition, and they've gone on to such incredible things. And I think after that time period, when I was moved to another school and that program ended, there was a part of me that had to integrate like what I had learned from that experience and to think about, okay, now that that's done, where am I here to serve the kids in this school? Where am I here to be of service? And so for a year, I was like, well, I'll just be a social studies teacher. I'll just fly under the radar. Nobody will know. And and then um, there were incidents at the school that started to occur. And the first year I was there, towards the end of my first year, there were two students that were very active and advocates for their fellow students who were Black students in the school dealing with racism. And so I was supporting those students directly that year towards the end. Then at the beginning of the next year, that conversation continued, but it continued in a different way. So the year before, about 60 students had asked the principal to come to the field to address racism. And in that moment, as the students were sharing their stories, the principal was sharing, I realized that there was a disconnect of understanding between the kids and the administration, but a deep desire on both sides to connect.
Mhm.
So the next year, when we were thinking, like, where do we move through this? I was working with a lot of my colleagues around their bias, around anti-racism, around culturally responsive education in ways that are not tokenistic. And then one day, a student who I had known, I had not taught him directly, but I had known, had come up to me at lunch and was like, Miss K, can I talk to you about some things that are going on? And I said, oh, of course, I'll drop everything. I have a prep. We can talk for 80 minutes. I could get my class covered. You have me for the afternoon.
Mhm.
So we went and we spoke. And what this student, I remember his body language is what affected me the most because in seeing his body language, I saw myself as a young person. I recognized that what he was going to share was going to be related to racism, it was going to be related to identity and where he belonged. And so when we spoke, he started to open up about how he came from a mixed background, a mixed heritage, how he was struggling to connect with his one parent around it, but the parent was trying, but even he felt conflicted about his identity because on his father's side, some of his ancestors had come from the United States and had been formerly enslaved, while other ancestors had come from Uganda. And so he was saying like I don't know really where I fit in to this identity, and I'm noticing that like some of my friends who maybe don't understand, they'll say things that I know are inappropriate, but I don't feel like I can speak up. I feel like I'm a sellout. I feel like I don't really fit in. I realized I was scared last year to join the other students in their advocacy because I didn't know, I felt like I was a fraud. Like I felt like I couldn't find my place. And, sometimes when I talk to my teachers and they seem a little held back, it makes me wonder, are they held back because they don't want to offend me, or are they held back because I'm a young Black man and I threaten them? And I just don't know where I belong in this world. And the look on his face was I just saw the pain that he was in. And so I asked him to talk more about his story and talk more about what he was feeling, about himself and the world around him and the people closest to him and the dreams that he had for himself. And through the conversation, as he began to open up, I began to tell him, I'm like, look, I can't know your experience because I have not lived in your life. I don't know. But I was able to talk to him about what colorism was, what internalized racism was, what ironic racism was, and how these things are ways that we are trying to navigate and hold a piece of our agency and dignity in a world that wants to make us small, in a world that wants to confuse us around and fracture that identity. And so through that conversation, whenever I would say, well, what you're experiencing with this group of students, that's lateral violence. And there's a reason for that. It's because neither of you feel safe. And it's easier to target each other. It's easier to harm each other, but you're both suffering through the same things because those students have the same feelings that you're having, but it's not talking with each other. And in giving him a language for what was happening to him and helping him to understand that there were words that were defined, he began to realize that it was not something he had to internalize, that it was not like it was hurting him, but it was not his fault. It was not because there was something intrinsically wrong with him as a person. And in his body language, I saw his head start to rise up. I saw the tears start to go away because it was that recognition of, well, if there have been terms about these things that are happening to me, then they must be so prevalent that it's systemic. And I was like, exactly. But it doesn't change the fact that it hurts us. And when we're able to have these conversations together, it helps us to stop feeling institutionally gaslit. It helps us to recognize that the emotions and the erasure that we're feeling are real. And at the end of that conversation, he gave me a big hug and he said, Miss Kay, this really helped today.
Mhm.
Can we, like, would you be okay if I talk to some of my other friends that are dealing with this? And could we maybe just have a club or something after school where we just come and we talk and we just share our stories? And I was like, of course. Like I have all the availability. You just let me know.
Mhm.
We don't even need to have a set date. I know you're all part-time working.
Mhm.
And so it just started happening that the kids started to come. So on the first day that the kids came, at first they only wanted me in the room. Um, and it was his friends, and they were sharing their stories. And through those stories, I learned about just how violent the racism had been against them that they had been holding in. These are things that I've experienced. I've experienced hate crimes. I've been the victim of hate crimes. And it was just a space where we could share those stories. The students could be affirmed in their feelings. I found ways that the students could process those feelings through catharsis. I remember one time getting Nerf guns, and I just said to the facilities staff, I'm like, could the kids just run around and we just play? And they were like, of course. And it was like, it made me tear up to see these kids just have ownership of the space in a space where they tried to hide. And through those conversations, the kids would be like, Miss Kay, is there a poem that speaks to this? I'm like, well, yeah, like there is. I can share you this poem, or I can share you this story, or we can watch this video. And I remember one day one of the other students saying, how do I navigate it when a person I'm having a conversation does A, B, and C, right? Like, what do I do? And so what I did was I showed them videos of James Baldwin and Muhammad Ali, and I was like, we didn't watch them just to watch them. We watched them to break it down as to like, do you see how James Baldwin didn't accept the premise of the argument that was being presented to him and how he so eloquently transitioned that. And we began to have it was also a safe space for me too. Like just being able to speak openly about those stories. I remember and me and this colleague like we are totally fine but I remember one day I was given a picture of the Twin Towers by a colleague.
mm,
And she had said that she had found it and that it reminded her of me. And this was after I had done a PD where I spoke about how I had experienced violent hate crimes after 9/11 and what that did to me as a young person, how I went from being a who are you to a what are you. And I
mm,
remember just being in stunned silence because my class was about to start. And I put the picture on the table. And then the students came in to visit before class started. And one of the students was like, looking at this picture, he's like, why do you have a picture of the Twin Towers? And I was like, and all I said was, it was a gift. That's all I said. It was a gift. And immediately the kids started laughing and running around the classroom and just being like, who gave you that, Miss K? Who gave you that? And we just started laughing because we already had that understanding. And so when I think about how that shaped teaching and learning, it was many months before the students felt comfortable to allow a non-racialized teacher into that space. And when they did, it was a colleague and a friend of mine. And the first day, me and the kids, we were just telling our stories. We were just talking about life, racism, the world, their interactions, what they're experiencing. And at a certain point, she said that she had to stand up and go to the corner. And she's like, I just need a minute to process my naivete. She
mm,
said, these students know so well everything. They know who on the staff doesn't like who on the staff. They know who on the staff likes this other person on staff. They know the almost like psychological templates of our fellow colleagues. And I said, of course they do, because they have to survive it. They
mm,
need to know which teacher doesn't like which teacher in case they're seen with this other teacher and that hurts them if they're in the class. Like they're already hyper vigilant
mm,
about what that is and having to navigate that. And these are kids who have had to navigate it since they were born. They have a PhD
mm,
in knowing how to navigate and survive whiteness and white supremacy and their place in it. And for her, it was like a call to action. And then I saw how that call to action spread throughout much of our staff because each teacher began to see what they didn't see. And I remember telling the staff once, I was like, there's going to come a day where you're going to read something, you're going to listen to something. You will not be able to do anti-racism from 8:30 to 4:30 and then not be an anti-racist after. I
mhm,
can give you an anti-racist lesson, but it will immediately stop being anti-racist if you teach it and you don't live it, you don't embody it in every day. And there were these moments where I saw my colleagues like the veil dropped. They could no longer see the world the way they had seen it before. And one of the more profound moments was the students had asked me if they would be allowed to do a panel for the staff at a PD. And for me as a teacher and someone who's very protective of students, I just said, I want to make sure that you're safe. I want to make sure that this conversation is safe. I want you to be authentic and let's create these parameters so that you're safe. And through that panel, those kids spoke so honestly and thoughtfully and powerfully about what they were experiencing that the staff were crying because they
mm,
realized these kids have had to endure this. I'm worried about a kid walking in 10 minutes late to my chemistry test, and that kid was just called a slur and had garbage thrown at them from a truck. And it gave them an understanding that these kids that were 14, 15, 16, and 17 had lifetimes of experience living in a world that the staff themselves, at the ages and the experience that they were at, could not have endured themselves. And it was a starting point. And so
mm,
it was because of that one student coming to me that one day, that one conversation about his story. It led to the students that were in that community space. Even when the students had a moment of lateral violence with another group of students, we brought all the students into the room and they were able to restore that relationship when we were talking about lateral violence and what was going on with all of them and why they were targeting each other. And through all those conversations, the kids started to say, well, why don't we have a curriculum? Why don't we have a curriculum for ourselves? And me and my friend were like, well, what would that look like for you? And so we helped the kids. The kids mapped it all out. I did all the labor with my friend of typing it out and dealing with the institution. But those students' names are on that curriculum, and it's the first curriculum of its kind in Alberta. It's probably the first curriculum of its kind in Canada, or even the United States. I sent it to the States. It's called Black North American Cultural Studies, and it is looking at the experience, identity, politics, sociology, the outcomes. The kids said, why can't the outcome be that we have an initiative in the school? Why can't the outcome be that we read a novel that is one that we choose from this time period? And it was so much about the kids. So the kids, they were the ones that gave that curriculum to life. We just created the structure around it. And then through that, the students created a Black Student Association. The students created a diversity policy for our school that is still in effect in that school.
Mm.
And that was their legacy. And I remember, like, they've every one of the students that are at university, they are doing wonderful. But I said to them, you've left quite a legacy.
Mm.
Like, you may never have been able to attend the class that you created, but there are now high schools here that are teaching it for other students. So lately, when I've been thinking about the one, like the story, I think about that one student. If he had not come to me that day and shared a story, none of that would have happened.
Well, thank you, Caitlin. That's beautiful. I'm nearly speechless after just reflecting on that. And that's so eloquently told as well, thinking on the disconnect that was happening. First at that student-led assembly in the field, although both sides wanted to achieve the eventual outcome that we were able to get through sharing stories generally as a starting point. So that's really beautiful and moving slowly and creating something more tangible and long-lasting than a rally or a big mass assembly, right? So that's really beautiful. Thank you so much, Brother Izzeldine. Do you have any thoughts or, uh, that really, nothing like the Black North American Cultural Studies, but in your work in Winnipeg and as taking you to New Zealand, do you have any similar reflections or connections you've been able to make with students?
Thank you, Caitlin, first of all, for that. It opened my heart for those
Hmm.
reflections, the agency, taking the time to listen, reshaping spaces so they can reflect us. I don't have the words, but I appreciate them, appreciate all the effort.
Hmm.
I think I echo many of the things you've stated, and the notion of legacy, where when we challenge colonial spaces by using our strong voices and strong stories, when we stand with those who are trying to find their stories, I think beautiful things happen. For me, similarly, I work in a lot of educational spaces. I offer a lot of work in educational spaces, and there are many stories that come to me this morning when you were talking. But one story, there was a student who was very always telling people where they were from. He would talk about his country and his food and his culture and his traditional clothing and so on. And all of a sudden, once, this student stopped sharing that. He would just stop telling people where he was from, and he would just be in the background, and you couldn't see the light coming from him anymore. And it reminded me that, silence in the classroom is not often disengagement. It is possibly and often is a way or a strategy of survival. Um, and when I took, the opportunity and I was able to talk to them, I think he quietly shared that they stopped talking about their home and culture and heritage because they found it easier than having to constantly explain and show and bring people and defend. He talked about defending his home, telling people, no, I am actually from there, and it means something to me. And it is, you might not see it on the map, or you might not see it the way I see it. And so, young people who are wobbling and carrying so many things at once, it's tiresome. I mean, for us adults, it's tiring. Imagine for a grade 8, a grade 7, a grade 9 student. And so that moment has never left me. And so for me, as a story person and somebody who approaches teaching and learning with stories, I pay close attention, I guess, to those notions, to those spaces. And I often ask folks who I work with, what knowledge do you consider to be legitimate? And why? And who might be carrying, and this is the second big question I ask when I enter spaces, who might be carrying the unspoken experience in your classes, in your spaces? And that goes for students and staff. And so I echo a lot of the things you said, Caitlin, and I think once we are able to find our inner story and bring it up and hold it and love it and be okay with it, we automatically start to shine and open spaces for others to do the same. So I similarly, in the way you do, I stand with those who are trying to find their stories by saying to them, look, there are many parts of my story that I haven't yet learned about, or I don't know how to share. I want to learn about and share in the way my grandmothers taught me and so on, but I'm not there yet. So that's okay if you are not there with your stories as well. It's not the destination for me, it's this journey that I'm after. And so I appreciate your love and appreciate the fact that you created this wonderful, sustainable information packaging, all this work in a curriculum document where students and staff and people can go to and use it to enhance and transform spaces and change.
That's really, really beautiful work indeed there, Caitlin. And just as a jumping up point and for the meditation on perhaps the story you had told, how can these small everyday stories in classrooms, moments often overlooked, help students and educators confront bias and imagine a more inclusive future, as we create the safe spaces, like Brother Yazidin said, for students to feel pride to share their stories, talk about their backgrounds, talk about the cultural nuances of their identity and find connection with others as well. How can doing that how can these moments help students or educators both confront bias and imagine a more inclusive future?
Mm. Um, so the student that I spoke about in the last question, I remember him saying, my teachers always say that they love us, they love their students, but how can you love me if you don't know me? And before you love me, I would love you to respect me. And in order to respect me, you have to respect and understand what I have endured, where I have come from, who I have come from. And I remember when we were speaking, I told him that old quote from Dr. West, where it said, you know, justice is what love looks like in public.
Mm.
When we seek justice, it is love for others, deep love. And, when I was a teacher, and the subjects of racism would come up, I would be vulnerable with my students. I would tell them that when I was a young person, how racism affected me growing up and what I had to endure through that and what my parents had to navigate because it was very hard for my dad in particular to see his youngest child dealing with the things that he had dealt with when
Mm.
he had been growing up. And I remember one of my colleagues being like, well, I don't have stories like that. And I was like, but you do have stories. Like you have stories of moments where you learned something, where you corrected yourself, where you recognize your patterns of behavior, maybe where you were outside of the norm of the oppression that you were witnessing, and you could speak to that. But one of the classes that I always think of fondly. It was a social studies class. It was my last year when I was teaching social studies before the role I'm in now. And we were talking about identity. And, this is the thing. We always ask her so much from our students, but we ask nothing of ourselves. We ask nothing of our own vulnerability. We ask nothing of our own bravery and courage in those conversations. And I've always tried to be a teacher where I don't overshare with my students. I will only ever share a story once I have found a lesson from that experience that can be shared. Because I don't I don't think it's sometimes responsible to just share stories that can be activating if there is not something that can be gifted, if there's not something that can be
Mhm.
taught through that story, especially in the role of an educator. And so when the subject of identity came up, and I'm going to tell you, this was not part of my lesson plan that day. I don't know what I was thinking, but I just said, and I was looking at my class, and it was such a wonderful group of young students. They were all grade 10s. And I just was like, there's an identity that some of us share in this classroom. And I'm like, I don't know, like I don't want to say, but maybe 20 years older than you, 30 years older than you. And we still share this identity, even though we come from different contexts in our cultures and our backgrounds, but we share the same themes. And I kind of made a joke about it, where it was like, I sometimes in my class where my students would say it kind of felt like a bit between like a really good like university session where everyone's talking and a stand-up comedy hour because I wanted to keep the students engaged. And my father always was about finding the absurdity, like locating the absurdity of hatred and oppression in order to heal through it. And so I said to the students, and I just jokingly said, is it okay for all the kids that are indigenous or the kids who are like fourth, fifth, sixth generation settlers here in Canada? Is it cool if I just talk to the kids in the class that are newly arrived to the country who like I don't even like to say newcomer, I say neighbor because that's really what I what it is. And I was like, and or if you're the child of immigrants or the child of refugees or you have that history, is that cool? Is that cool if I do that? And I've done this before. I did it once when I was discussing patriarchy, and I asked all of those students that identified as female if it would be okay if I could talk to those who identified as male about patriarchy first. And then I took the boys through a day in the life of living in patriarchy as a male and how it harms them. And it opened their eyes to recognizing that it's not so easy to dismiss, that it's actually affecting them in really harmful ways too. So I did the same thing here around this identity piece. And all the kids were like, yep, we're ready for this one. Like, let's do it. And I was like, okay. And I'm like, because I was raised by a refugee. One of the examples I was like, so you go, let's say you go over to your friend's house, you're playing video games. They start screaming at their mother back and forth, telling her to do this, to do that. And you are having a panic attack inside because you could, A, never talk to your mother or your father like that. And you're also kind of terrified that their parent is going to call your mom. And when she finds out that you just sat there eating Cheetos, you're going to get yelled at when you get home. And all of the kids started laughing and like pounding their hands on the table like it was like a stand-up comedy routine. And the one student was looking at his friend and he was like, that was me at your house on Friday when you were yelling at your mom. And it was super funny. And then I was like, okay, here's another example. You and your friend have a really big test. You both want to get into the same program in university. Your friend gets a 90% on the test and she's thrilled. She's absolutely thrilled. You get 97% on the same test and you are so dejected by that. And one of the kids was like pointing at himself, being like, that's me. And I'm like, yes. And I'm like, when I was a kid growing up, I thought, my grandmother did not survive the things she survived. So I could not get 100% on this test. And the kids started laughing again. And then I was like, now here's one that is not so pleasant. Let's say you're the person in your family that is able to speak fluent English, and your landlord is approaching the door. And you have to decide as a 14, 15-year-old kid what you translate to your grandmother because he is being racist. And you don't want to scare your grandmother, but you also have to navigate that situation. And there were students that just sort of like nodded and were like, yeah, that happens to me. And then right after that, I had gone over to grab my lunch and I had it in a little, not a Tupperware, but like in an empty yogurt container. I started eating my lunch out of the container. And one of the students was like, now I know you were raised by a refugee because that's your Tupperware. And we all started laughing again. And I remember one of the students who was a white student, white presenting student, he came up at the end of class and he was like, that was the best class. He's like, I've never had conversations like that. I didn't know that my friend felt like that when I would yell at my mom. And he was like, can we do that again? And there were these moments in that class, once that moment happened, where the kids felt like honored and also like excited to share their experiences in those moments. And that's sort of where when I think about inclusivity, it's such a broad word, but it asks so much of us as well. And such a huge part of that is letting kids know that you are in you are in it with them. You are not this person overseeing it. You are in it with them. You have had these experiences, um, that you can see that we are more connected than we are different in a lot of these cases, and that our differences are what prevent us sometimes from seeing a whole person.
Mhm.
And throughout my classes, what would happen is the students would say it kind of felt like a little cocoon, not from the world in like a way that you're hiding from it, but like the students wouldn't be on their phones. They just wanted to be engaged in those conversations. And also like deferring to students, like when a student wants to share, to just defer to that and be like responsible in terms of like, okay, you please share that. Also bringing in those stories, like there's so many, when people say like what would a culturally responsive lesson look like in math, for instance, and I would be like, well, when you're learning about like doubling up units, having students bring in their grandmother's recipes, having them speak to what those recipes mean, talking about their grandparents, maybe bringing in an audio recording of their grandmother speaking about that recipe and what it means. And then you share food together at the end of the year. And like there's these moments where it's like we don't have to shut those stories out. We don't have to shut those stories out. And that was one thing I saw with a lot of the students, is that they were so eager to have those moments. But unless we create the space for those moments to breathe, unless we create the safety in that room. In all of my classes, I would always put up the seven sacred teachings, always on the board. And those were like a touchstone, because when I would see a student sharing a story and they would say, like, if there was a student that was being disrespectful to another student, then we would speak about the value of respect in that terms. But if there was a student where they said, "Oh, I don't know, like my story's not that important. I Nobody really wants to hear it." I just would point at the part about respect and be like, "What is our rule in this room? Our rule in this room is respect, respect of others, but respect of yourself."
Mhm.
The kid you're talking about, that you're saying nobody's going to care what they're saying, I like that kid. That's you. I like you. I want to know your story. I respect you in your story. And helping them to recognize that those same values were for them too. And so like, and these kids, they're growing up in a world where they don't think that who they are and what they bring into a room is valuable unless it comes with a follower count. They think of these sincere, authentic stories as content, as opposed to being like the building blocks of who they are and their character and their worldview. And one of the metaphors I would share with my students around that and around social media and authenticity and storytelling and share and the conversations was, there's the firefly and there's the North Star. And because I never wanted students to feel guilty about their need to be seen, even if it's on social media. And I would just be like, no, you want to be seen. Like you're the cosmos incarnate. You are like you are made of stardust. Like, as Carl Sagan said, like you are this. And I just would be like, and there's no shame in wanting to follow that firefly. They're beautiful, they're fleeting, they sparkle. But the North Star, it might not be the brightest star in the sky, but it orients everything and everyone around it. It is what you follow when you're lost. It has been the same star that your ancestors, my ancestors, just like the moon, would look up to. And when my students would ask me, like, when they're like, Miss K, like, we're so curious, like, what is your political affiliation? What is your religion? Right? Like, that's where they would always go to that, because they would be like, your space is so like everyone comes in here. Like, everyone wants to be in this room. And I didn't have a direct answer. And I just said, I said, I respect so many different ways of viewing the world. There is so much good to be taken from the way that other people have interpreted this world, have faith in this world. But I said to the students, I was like, think about your worst night, like your worst night when you felt like you didn't belong. Did you look up at the moon? And they were like, yeah. And I'm like, isn't it interesting? All of us come from different backgrounds, religions, cultures, experiences, but we've all had one of those nights where we've looked up at that moon and we have thought, why am I here? Who am I? Do I belong anywhere? Will I always be othered? Will I always be the outcast? And I was like, sometimes when I look at that moon, I have to remind myself, like, that's the same moon my grandmother looked at when she was escaping genocide. That is the same moon that her ancestors looked at, not knowing. And it's a constant in my life because that moon will still be there. And I'm like, I don't know what that means about my political affiliation. I don't know what that means about my religion. But I do know that the moon has a very sacred space in a lot of religions and a lot of spiritual practices. And I know in my culture, like Assyrians, Anana is one of our predominant goddesses, and she is of the moon. So I just said, like, when you think you do not belong, you look at that moon and you remember that you are the dream of your ancestors. People that never even knew you survived it because one day they knew someone like you could exist maybe. And so you get to do whatever you want in this world. And it was interesting because even in that conversation, the kids were talking about tough nights, tough breakups when they would look at that moon and the depth of what they felt. And then began to share culturally how the moon was significant to their own cultures. And this is where I think that, with anti-racist teaching, it's about being a human being. It's about what it means to be a human being to each other. And we redefine what that word means, humanity, with our actions every day, with what we choose, with who we view as a human. And I think sometimes in education, we get so limited by time and space in our classrooms. And I used to always joke that, time is a colonial construct. The sun rises, the sun sets, and everything in the middle is negotiable. So until that happens, everything's negotiable. Because when we don't allow for those moments to exist, you will always cover everything you have to cover in a class. Because as teachers, we can always figure that out. What we can't cover is those moments that we need to let breathe and live as our students live. And if we try to rush through it, if we try to say, okay, we got 3, 4, 5 minutes, a kid might say, I don't really got time to share. I don't know what I want to say yet. And even just giving the opportunity to revisit. And it's interesting because like right now I don't work directly with students right now, but this is my last year where I get to go back to a classroom. I cannot wait to be back in a school with young people. I cannot wait to be sitting in a circle and hearing these kids and their
Mm,
stories, letting them know how important they are, and letting them know that more important than going viral is being vital,
mm,
being vital to yourself, to others, and you are not measured by clicks or likes. You are inherently special. You are inherently important. No one on this earth is going to look at the world exactly the way you look at it. And maybe your perspective and your stories and your lessons are what this world needs to go forward in a better way through love. Like as Izadin and I were talking about love. And so when I think about inclusion, like we know what it feels like when we belong. When I was in New Zealand, when I was with like we were at the Whipsy, when people ask me what that experience was like, I have never felt more seen. I have never felt so much belonging. I have never felt so much safety in my body as when I
mm,
was there. It was profound. And then when I returned home to Alberta, I it was like my body could no longer accept that. Now that I had felt this, to come back to a place where I could not feel that. And then I realized like there was a disconnect there and I had to hold on to this for as long as I could. And so I'm still trying to hold on. But I do think like belonging, it is mental, it is emotional, it is physical, but it is most deeply spiritual. And in anti-racism, we talk a lot about spirit murder. What that feels like, there's a term, spirit murder. But there are spirit restorers and there are spirit protectors. And sometimes our spirits feel like they have to leave us so that we can endure what is coming to us tangibly. But we have to remember to call our spirit back. And sometimes we can't do that alone. Sometimes we need someone to help us do that. So,
Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Caitlin. That was really beautiful. Thank you for just getting at the core essence of it there, giving space for love to feel safe, for love to germinate, and for us to find that healing through the absurdity of hate, healing through the absurdity of disconnection as well, so that we can laugh through our pain and come together. Like Irene, I really wish I could go back to being 14 and, experience some of these groundbreaking and life-shifting work you're doing in terms of, again, providing things that even your father would have benefited from in the times he was a student, right? Providing those spaces where we can, yeah, just again, center the human connection.
it's funny. It's funny you say that, Hafiz, because I said to someone recently, when I help a student, that's my grandmother. When I see a student come to me with the same issues as my father and my grandmother, that's me. Like I should not exist. Like if you look at the track record of what they had to endure, I should not be here. So many things had to happen to exist, and not just exist, but to exist in education. And so when a student comes, that's my grandmother. It's come full circle.
Hmm. Full circle indeed. That's really beautiful. And just again, just a lot of what you said is so resonant and just resonating in my head when you said there. So I guess as an educator, it's good to know what you ask of yourself is that true acting out your calling, not just checking off the boxes and saying, okay, what's in the curriculum and how do I get this done at the time? No, really, how do I create the space and stretch time in a way beyond what is, rational and what's possible, even to allow for people to discover themselves beyond a follow accounts, beyond a piece of content. And again, remember what it is to be human and to develop vitality for each other. It's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing your work with us. It's really inspiring. Thank you, Kate. Thank you. Brother Ezedin, do you have any thoughts on that second question in particular?
Oh
And
my
just reflecting on
goodness. Oh
it.
my goodness. I need days to process all this,
Mhm.
Kathleen. Thank you so much. I'm still hung and immersed in spirit protector. Who is your spirit protectors? I think that is, I'm going to do a lot of work on learning about that. So I love that. Um, I think everything Kidlin so beautifully put together echoes everything in my heart today. I think I'll finish with a story to answer that question. I've worked super hard when I arrived to Canada to get rid of my accent because I wanted to sound a certain way. And maybe Hafiz, you know stories like this. Caitlin, you may know stories of people who come up from places and they ask you and they tell you all the time, speak English so you can get a job, speak English so people don't pick on you, speak English the way Canadians speak English and so on. And so I would actually learn, read books and listen to tape, cassettes at the time and CDs and so on to try to
Mhm.
speak Canadian. And I quickly realized that I was getting rid of a big part of who I was and a big part of who I am. And so once I reclaimed that part, and it's been a journey, everywhere I go now, I take, whether I'm a guest speaker, whether I'm about to run a session, whether I'm about to speak in front of students, I actually take time to speak in Arabic. and I welcome everybody in Arabic. And I also speak, and I tell the story of my accent and how it is now something that I love, and it made me who I am now. And I remember, students coming to me going, I was there too. I didn't want my friends to know that I spoke another language, so I tried to hide my accent. Or when my grandparents or my father or mother used to come into the school, I would meet them outside so that my colleagues or my classmates don't hear them speak English and so on.
Mhm.
And so I think to bring this full circle, as Caitlin did, I think those stories humanize us. They humanize the spaces. They challenge the single narrative. They bring students and teachers close. I got teachers who would say, because of those stories, I now know my students better. Because of the slowing down that Caitlin talked about, spending time with your students, I'm also healing along with my students. I'm also trying to find, and this is something I've heard from my friends who are white teachers, who like, I thought I didn't have a story, but now I'm learning that I do. And I want to bring those stories of my family, my community, where my parents and grandparents came from, into the classroom and share them with my students. So I think over time, when we build schools and classrooms and spaces, educational spaces where empathy is learned through relationships, not just policy. I think that's where we start to imagine an inclusive space, a truly inclusive space where people are recognized, people's dignities are protected. People don't have to feel like they have to hide who they are or parts of who they are. They can just come and be the way they want to be. And so I want to say thank you, Caitlin, from the bottom of my heart for sharing these beautiful, powerful stories. And I know this is just the beginning of
Yes.
many collaborations and many stories.
Oh, thank you both so much. Thank you so much for inviting me in today. Like it's always such a pleasure talking with you, and it was so lovely to meet you, Hafiz. And like I just thank you so much for this morning. You're truly. It was spirit restoring for sure.